Interrupting the normal programming to embark on a special rolling coverage on Yemen and the attacks that have been conducted today. As an introduction, I should tell you that Saudi Arabia has confirmed that two of its pipeline booster stations have come under attack. The Saudi energy minister says the Yemeni military drones in the port city of Yanbu carried out those attacks. The official said that Saudi Arabia stopped pumping on major east-west oil pipeline. And we have Yemeni military sources saying that 7 drones conducted attacks on vital Saudi facilities, and the sources say that the attacks were in response to Saudi Arabia's constant aggression against Yemen and also the blockade that has imposed on the Yemeni people. And those sources also say that people of Yemen are ready to carry out more strikes if the Saudi aggression and blockade continue. Now, let's discuss those developments, and we'll have Saeed Shahabi, political analyst and Middle East expert, who's joining us from London, and also Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, who's joining us out of Bristol. Now, let's go to Saeed Shahabi in London. We know that more than 4 years pass, and despite all those attacks, some 19,000 stories of airstrikes against the Yemeni people that have mostly targeted the civilians there. It has ruined the infrastructure there. And after all these years and all those sufferings, we have now news of Saudi Arabia's being vulnerable to Yemeni attacks. Let's have your comments on that to begin with.
Thank you very much. Of course, 4 years of destruction has caused so much calamities and problems in Yemen. Destruction, human and material. Thousands, as you mentioned, thousands, up to 65,000 are said to have perished in those attacks, merciless attacks by the Saudi, Emirati, probably conducted and directed by Israelis also. So 4 years on, and it is clear that the Saudi-Emirati alliance has failed, and disastrously failed, because not only that their war has stalled, but they have also, the war has now come to haunt them back in their own lands. And it is really, really amazing that the Yemeni people are capable of such resilience, coming back from all the destruction of war and conducting long-range attacks on the Saudis and the Emiratis, because sometimes there were some drones that attacked Abu Dhabi itself. And we hear today that 7 drones were dispatched by the Yemeni Air Force to Riyadh to attack Aramco installations. That is a very important development and very worrying, not only to the Saudis, but to their backers in Washington and London, because this is a material development that had not been anticipated by these forces when they decided to attack Yemen. So I think it is worrying. Of course, it's worrying to everybody, because it means that more destruction, more widening of the scope of the war, more casualties. And I think this is all not good news for us as Arabs, as Muslims, as people of the Middle East, because until when this childish behavior by the Saudis and the Emiratis going to continue? And the only people who are paying the price are our own people, whether they are in the Arabian Peninsula or in Yemen or in Bahrain or in the Emirates or in Iran. So this, it is the normal people who are paying the price of this foolish war that has continued unabated despite the calls by the people to stop it.
Mm-hmm. Now, from Bristol, let me bring in Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, to ask his opinion about the ramifications of such attacks in this part of the world.
Well, I think for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of this today, horrible to see, that something that could threaten the global economy, and that's effectively what attacks on the Saudi pipelines mean, could actually be allowed to take place. I would have thought that with all the Western backing that there is, all the satellite help there is from the National Security Agency, from the United States, from the Pentagon, that the Saudis have, that they would be able to detect and stop drone attacks like this in Saudi territory. So these pipelines, of course, are incredibly vulnerable. And this is something that military analysts for decades, probably since the Second World War, really have been talking about how vulnerable they are. And to see an attack like this today, what appears to be an effective attack, shows to me either of one of two things: either that there is a deliberate bringing down of the defences by the West to allow this kind of thing to happen to Saudi Arabia, or that there's the Yemenis have found some kind of gap in the defences to use. So I think it really is only one of either of those. I would expect, with all of the surveillance and electronic warfare capabilities that are given to the Saudi Arabians by I think you have to call it a strange alliance, because we're never really entirely sure who is leading this alliance. It is an alliance of Israel, Saudi Arabia, NATO, the US, and the UK. Who is actually in charge? And we end up looking at this as a sort of series of front organisations. We're looking at the Saudis today, but who is really driving Saudi policy? And is it? I mean, many believe, of course, it's Western interests of the arms industry, because they're making fantastic profits. Anyone who's a shareholder in arms firms in the West will be, horrible to say, but it's true, pleased with the amount of money that Saudi Arabia has been spending of its oil revenues on arms from the West. So I think this is something which has been being expected for a long time. My main question today has to be: has the West deliberately not informed Saudi Arabia that this attack was ongoing and allowed it to take place, because it's part of a wider agenda to ramp up tensions in the Middle East, which Mike Pompeo, the Christian Zionist head of the State Department now, effectively the US Foreign Secretary, he is buying into, I think, a ramping up of tensions, and this may be a way of doing that in the Middle East. Certainly, very few in the West want to see any kind of disruption in the financial system, but it may be that there are even deeper agendas that they're planning for disruption of the financial system, and they're also planning for escalating tensions. That's certainly what this tour of Mike Pompeo. It's interesting, isn't it, I think, how different Pompeo is to the previous Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson. He was from the Exxon Corporation, the oil company, and he was wanting to make sure that the oil supplies around the world were guaranteed, because obviously he's from that industry. Whereas Mike Pompeo is a very different character. He's somebody who I think the Israelis really welcome. It's not most Israelis, but the Israeli state, the government in Israel, welcomes. Because he's buying into their agenda of ramping up tensions in the Middle East. And what with the recent elections as well in Israel, it means Netanyahu's feeling extremely confident that he can ramp up tensions. I mean, many people think, why would they do this? Because this is potentially very dangerous. It could have a domino effect on tensions with bringing in the United States, bringing in Russia, possibly ultimately even China into a conflict. And but I'm afraid there are strange motivations behind Pompeo and his wish to ramp tensions up. There are long-term attempts to balkanize the Middle East and to create new countries, very much like the British did way back in the time of the First World War, and drawing the lines with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement. These sorts of plans are not quite so secret now. So I think we need to be quite smart and think, well, maybe the Americans, maybe the British, maybe the Israelis and the NATO countries, for which effectively Saudi Arabia is a proxy these days, maybe they've allowed this deliberately to happen because it actually fits with Rex Tillerson, what many people are now calling his war tour, as he's been in London last week, and he's meeting with Lavrov and Putin, people believe as well, making the point that, well, tensions are escalating in the Middle East anyway, so we need to be prepared for war. And of course, we don't want that, not ordinary British people. And I was very pleased to see yesterday the Foreign Office in London saying that there could be a war by accident. Well, that will only happen by accident if there's no proper scrutiny of the intelligence services and how well or badly, they're informing the Saudis as to whether there may be a drone attack on the horizon. So the big question for me is, this drone attack has happened, the pipeline has been stopped, I believe, and so why hasn't this happened before? Maybe it's just that the NATO alliance and the Americans have deliberately dropped their defences that they provide for Saudi Arabia today.
Interesting point. Now let me go to London and SA Shahabi. As Mr. Shahabi, Tony Gosling just referred to the U.S. Being willing in terms of escalating the already tense situation in the Middle East region, and especially in the Persian Gulf area. But let's see what you think could be behind this. So what could the U.S. get out of a tense Middle East region?
Well, first of all, the prices of oil have shot up already, reached $70 a barrel.
72 now, yes, Brent.
That is not a good news for the Western economies. But at the same time, they want also to open up these wars in order, as my colleague said, in order for the arms manufacturing companies to sell more. But where do they draw the line between higher oil prices and wider sales of arms to the Middle East? This is number one. Number two, wars will always have fallouts, and probably they will lead to a new form of terrorism, as we have seen in the past. The war in Iraq, the results of which led to the emergence of Al-Qaeda, and then ISIS. The war on Syria led to the emergence of ISIS, and so on. So the West is creating the environment for the emergence of extremist ideologies and terrorist organizations and the groups. That is not a good sign or a good thing for the world. Number three, this polarization of politics, which is taking place at the moment, is bad also, where you have, even within the Western alliance, you have almost all the Western European governments are not happy with the performance of Donald Trump in America. And then at the same time, Mr. Trump is also polarizing the situation in Southeast Asia with his tension and targeting of China. Mr. Trump now is opening three fronts at the same time, which is not a good policy. A front in Asia with North Korea, another front in Latin America with against Venezuela, and then another a third front in the Middle East with Iran. I mean, is this really strategic thinking, or is it a kind and a reflection of deep-rooted madness in the mind of those who are in?
Well, we just had a bad connection with London, so let's go to Bristol to Tony Gosling. Tony, let's now concentrate on another aspect of what's going on in Yemen, and that's the plight of the Yemeni people. The situation has got worse and worse, after the UN sponsoring those talks on truce in Sweden. They came to an agreement. An agreement was signed by both the Houthi fighters, Ansarullah movement, and also the other side. But on the ground, the Hodeidah port city was going to be opened up for humanitarian aid to arrive. There's a lifeline, as you know, for the Yemenis. The Ansarullah forces unilaterally withdrew from Hodeidah and two other ports to let in humanitarian aid to come in. But that has not happened. I mean, also international organizations have not been able to do anything to help alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people.
Yeah,
Tony.
I think another aspect to this whole business, I think, is we need to take often what we get in the Western media is we get very sort of quick bullet point news coverage of specific events. What they never do nowadays, and really before the mid-1990s, this used to happen. For example, in the first Gulf War, the BBC did a very good job actually. We're talking about 1989, 1990, of putting the context, the history behind particular different factions, different countries, that sort of thing, different religious groups in the region. We don't get that at all now. We get very, very narrow coverage of specific events. And what they never do is they don't step back and contextualize, for example, this enormous dependency on Middle Eastern and particularly Saudi oil, and how that came about in the first place. I mean, it was completely deliberate. In 1945, in February 1945, before the end of the war in Europe, so there were obviously plans looking beyond the war, during the war, to see what was going to happen afterwards. When President Franklin Roosevelt in February 45 met with King Abdulaziz at Bitter Lake in the Suez Canal to cook up the sorts of deals between Saudi Arabia and the United States that we see still today. And it's actually been a horrendous agreement, a sort of devil's pact between the two countries, saying, well, we will become totally dependent on Saudi Arabian oil. And this is effectively what Roosevelt was saying. The United States has become the greatest consumer of oil, of course, pushing all these fossil fuels into the atmosphere, and they would make sure through this military agreement, an economic agreement, that the Saudi Arabia was going to be a fortress for them in the Middle East. And by signing that paper there, Abdulaziz really sold Saudi Arabia's soul. As part of that deal, there was the massive financing of the madrasas and of the schools to teach the Wahhabism, the Takfiri schools, which we see now today, the Salafist schools, which is this twisted version of Islam. And that, I think, is the origin of much of the tension we're seeing in the Middle East today. But key to all of that is this US dependence on oil, and the West in general's dependence on oil. In fact, even we in the UK are massively dependent on oil as a result of that deal that Roosevelt signed. In Britain, we had we invented the railways, okay, in the 1800s here in Britain, and we had the best railway system the world has ever seen. But the City of London would not lend the money to the oil companies to build oil rigs to get oil out of the North Sea above north of Scotland. And so this is what industry insiders have told me. What then happened is that the oil companies, BP, Shell, the rest of them, then went off to the United States, and the Americans did lend the money to build the oil rigs and to extract the oil from the North Sea on one condition. And that condition was that we were not allowed to depress the oil price around the world. So we had to, in Britain, we had to extend and build a massive demand in the UK for the oil from the North Sea. And that meant the close down of the railways in 1963. Pretty much half or even more of the British railway network was closed completely. And then they started building motorways, and everyone became dependent on the car. So I think a lot of these people who've been protesting in Extinction Rebellion in London should really, do a bit of their homework and look at the history of why the West has become so dependent on cars and has basically written off as a kind of background thought all other forms of transport. And a lot of that is basically the Americans tying the British and other European nations. I mean, it's Germany as well, of course, in World War II was building its autobahns, then the Americans picked up with their freeways, the British with their motorways, the French with motorways, etc., Autostrada in Italy. This was a whole program that was rolling out in the 1950s and 60s after the autobahns of Nazi Germany in order to make the West dependent on this Saudi oil, to tie us in, to make sure that we don't have any choice. And of course, that is also a quid pro quo for that, is these pipelines are incredibly vulnerable. So I think some big questions need to be asked around the West, and particularly in intelligence circles and amongst any parliamentarians that are allowed to scrutinise what these intelligence services get up to, is why did the defences that the West provides to Saudi Arabia fall down today, and why was this allowed to happen? Because I don't think it's an accident.
Good question. Let's go back to London. Saeed Shahabi, I talked to a number of guests in our rolling coverage a couple of hours ago on the same situation, and some of them believe that the Yemenis have been really exercising self-restraint, and they've been really patient after more than 4 years and all what they have gone through. They just started attacking the Aramco pipeline and booster stations, and they believe that such attacks should have happened much earlier than this, don't you think?
Well, I'm sure that the Yemenis would have loved to defend their territories properly. They have bravely stood up to the challenges of the onslaught by the Saudis and the Emiratis, supported by the Americans and the British. But their capabilities were limited. But at the same time, when they stood up to those challenges, they have surprised the world, because nobody expected that with all the armaments the Saudis and the Emiratis had, that they would be able to stand up on their feet and withstand all this onslaught for the past 4 years. Yet they have managed to do so. Whether they had the capability to strike at the heart of Riyadh or Abu Dhabi is unlikely. I don't think they had it at the beginning. They had missiles from the old time of Yemen, mostly probably Soviet-made missiles. But apart from that, they didn't have the modern technology that would enable them to fly and to send drones hundreds of miles away to the heart of Arabia. And it is probably that they have been able to develop this over the past 4 years. So they had done what they could, but at the same time, we must not underestimate the forces that are attacking them. You have the two major forces of powers of America and Britain, and in addition to the strongest economies of the Saudis and the Emiratis in the Arab world. So, and against whom? Against the poorest Arab country. I think what has happened has really surprised everyone. How could they have withstood all this for 4 years non-stop, without food and with blockade from the sea and air and land? So I think they deserve to be congratulated for their steadfastness.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate your comments. That was Saeed Shahabi, political analyst and Middle East expert, joined us from London. We also had Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, who joined us from Bristol on this special rolling coverage on developments in Yemen. Thank you for watching. In a few minutes' time, we'll have a news bulletin for you.